I've heard of a city called heaven, and I'm striving to make a heaven, Lord.
Hi, I'm Gita Strausberg, host of the Strausberg Report, and I have a very special guest with me today. His name is Robert Marovich. He is the author of A City Called Heaven, Chicago and the Birth of Gospel Music. You must buy this book. That is, if you want to know about the history of black gospel. Welcome to the Strausberg Report.
Ms. Strausberg, thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, you're welcome.
Appreciate
Thank you for accepting.
Oh, my pleasure.
Now, you're from Hammond, Indiana.
Originally, yes.
And you've been in Chicago since?
Since 1985, I moved here right after college.
Where did you go to college?
Went to University of Notre Dame.
And you majored in?
American Studies, much to the dismay of all of my relatives who thought I would be a doctor or a lawyer. But I gave up on law early on, and there was no ability for me in science. So,
why American Studies?
you know, it was really the combination of courses that they offered. So it was an opportunity to study history, politics, literature, philosophy, and journalism. And that seemed to be the way I was going. I was writing stories, dumb stories, like when I was 5 and 6 years old.
Wow.
So I always sort of felt that that was my calling. And that seemed to fit really well. And then I had a minor in business because I kind of felt like if I don't at least have some kind of practicality in here, I'd better do something that has some practicality. So they had a minor program in business. Mm-hmm. And so I graduated with a minor in business and a major in American Studies. Got my MBA years later.
And that was in?
I graduated in 1985 from Notre Dame and then got my MBA in 2002.
All right, that's great. So now, how did you get involved in black gospel music?
Well, you know, it was actually goes back to my days in college. In 1984, I was a music minister for our dorm. Notre Dame's a Catholic university, and every dorm had its own chapel, and I was in charge of the music. And one Sunday, I was getting ready to plan the music, and I turned on the radio looking for a station I used to enjoy growing up. And on that station at that point in time was the Cosmopolitan Church of Prayer radio broadcast. And I just sat there transfixed. I always had an affinity for black music, even as a child. When my friends were buying Beatles records and so forth, I was buying Booker T and the MGs and Motown. But I'd never heard gospel music until that evening, and I just thought, this is where it all began. So I quickly threw a tape in the tape machine, and I recorded the broadcast, and I listened to Father Hayes and Diane Williams and Alan Cathay, never knowing years later I'd actually meet these individuals. But it sparked an interest in me in gospel music, and then fast forward, my late wife Pat was a director of music at Providence St. Mel School. And at the end of every concert, as the choir director, she would end with a gospel song, whatever it was of the day, Kirk Franklin, Orlando Draper, and I got reinvigorated in gospel there and decided, well, I should learn something about this music that I enjoy. So I started reading what I could and collecting a few records, and that's kind of where it all started.
Did your friends think you were strange?
When I was growing up, yes, and strange would be the nice word to call. They didn't understand. This little, crew-cutted, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy from Northwest Indiana. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't I be listening to polka music or,
right.
the Beatles or something? But there was something about rhythm and blues, about soul music, and again, Booker T was my intro. There was something about it that it really struck me. And I always had that. Grew up, then when I got older, I would pick up blues or R&B or vocal group harmony. I was really and I still enjoy vocal group harmony like the Flamingos and all that. But gospel spoke to me in a way. I mean, when you talk about songs that you have to pull over to the side of the road, no other song does that but gospel music for me. So now my friend Kenneth Widge Jr., who's a longtime gospel writer and director, he thinks I was born again. He says, I think you were somebody else in another life, and I think you were one of us.
I kind of agree with him, too. So now, did black gospel music, did it begin with slavery? How did it begin? I mean, the real origin.
Sure. It really did. It came from West Africa. When the enslaved Africans came here, as you know, they didn't have anything but their culture to bring with them. And so they, through oral tradition, passed along these traits, these characteristics of the music of celebration and worship from West Africa, and it stayed in the culture. So the fundamentals of gospel, in fact, Pearl Williams Jones, who's the late musicologist, said that gospel kind of kept more of its Africanisms than any other type of black music. She said, so for example, hand clapping and foot patting and repetition and falsetto and shouting, all of these things come from, and the gospel kept that. But it was, of course, it wasn't called that then. It was congregational singing, hymn singing.
But they weren't, those Africans were not Christian.
No, but it translated well over so that when Africans were Christianized in the United States, the type of Christianity felt right to them, because here was an individual who was cursed, suffered, died on a cross, and rose again. And I'm sure you could empathize with that as someone who was brought here, suffered, and crucified metaphorically, and that there was an opportunity for a better life, that it wasn't just going to end this way. Mm-hmm. And so through a pattern of adaptation from the songs that came over, like the ring shout and those types of songs that came over, to the development of the pre-concert spiritual, to the congregational singing that would take songs from the Baptist hymnal or from the Great Awakening hymnals and adapt them with the Africanisms of the congregational singing of the church.
Now, there are different kinds of gospel singing. Mm-hmm. You have the Baptists who sing kind of more slow than the Pentecostal. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, that was the thing. In the Pentecostals sort of kept more of that congregational worship sound that went back centuries. The Baptists tended to adapt the hymn of their white peers in the Baptist church and tried to sing those songs, and especially in Chicago in that time, and that was where I think the spark of gospel really happened, is you had the Baptists and the Methodists, Presbyterians, so forth, singing very straight, four square hymns, not a lot of shouting, not a lot of anything else other than hymn singing. And you have the newcomers, the migrants, coming from a traditionally older sound, the congregational singing of spirituals and hand clapping, coming to Chicago, hearing the Baptist church singing these slower songs and not feeling like this represented their experience.
Right.
So this kind of clash of cultures kind of helped develop gospel music as we know it.
So then you also have different styles of singing. You have the quartets. Mm-hmm. Talk about that.
Sure, and actually quartets predate gospel.
Oh, really?
Because the quartet was really an entertainment vehicle. Going back to the 19th century, the quartet sang popular songs, they sang spirituals, they sang all kinds of things. Old MacDonald had a farm to a spiritual. But then the quartet, there were churches had their own quartets for Christian entertainment that would sing sacred songs. Mm-hmm. And so there was that Jubilee style of quartet singing that predated gospel, and they only adapted gospel when it seemed like they were either going to die or they needed to remain relevant. So you had people like R.H. Harris, for example, here in Chicago, or Charles Bridges, who combined the singing style of the church and the gospel songs and some of the more, say, even the Pentecostal sounds into the quartet harmonies and blended that. So that's how you get this sort of real strong quartet sound that developed in the 40s and 50s.
You have the Jubilees.
Yes.
Talk about them.
Yeah, the Jubilee singers. Well, that was really kind of the popular style of.
They've been around a long time.
They sure have. And so the Fisk Jubilee singers, who still have an iteration. And in Chicago back in the 30s and before that, there were all these different. There was the Eureka Jubilee singers who did. It was a very tight 4-part harmony. There was a singing style that was rhythmic, like the Golden Gate Quartet, but you wouldn't necessarily have a lead singer to do a vamp or and I say that and I think of the Pace Jubilee singers where they kind of did have that, but it was unusual. Jubilee singing was more rhythmic, more harmonic, not real, there wasn't a lot of emotional draw into that. And so that's where that comes from.
Talk about the Pilgrim Baptist Church and its importance to gospel music.
Sure. Mostly that comes from Thomas Dorsey's involvement there. There's a misunderstanding that it was the birthplace of gospel music. It actually wasn't. It was actually Ebenezer. Ebenezer at 45th and Vincennes. That was where Dorsey and Fry, Theodore Fry, started the first gospel chorus.
Excuse me.
So Pilgrim Baptist, really because Dorsey became the music minister in 1932, is kind of how they got on the map. Pastor Austin there recognized that Dorsey was a very strong leader at Ebenezer in leading this gospel chorus with Theodore Fry. So he encouraged him to set up a gospel chorus at Pilgrim. And so and that much to the dismay of Edward Boatner, who was their music minister. And Edward is, of course, known as a great spirituals composer and arranger. And he just thought, we don't want this fan dance music in this church. But they agreed to let Dorsey be minister of the choir, the director of the choir, if he would do it for no fee. And he did. And from there, he started their gospel chorus. And from there, he and Magnolia Lewis Butts and Fry started the National Convention of Gospel Choirs and Choruses.
Now, Pilgrim Baptist Church, Thomas Dorsey, he was the father of gospel.
Yes.
And why do we say that?
We say that because before him, it really wasn't gospel music as we know it. There were gospel singers, there were gospel hymns, there were gospel songs. But what Dorsey did in gospel music was to take the hymns, the spirituals, the camp songs, the camp meeting songs, and his own compositions, and give them a vibrancy that spoke to the migrants, spoke to the youth. It had a beat. And that's what was needed to sort of revive the African American church music style in Chicago at that time. So his writing, his publishing, his starting the National Convention, his really giving voice to this, what he called heart songs, these songs that had tremendous faith, hope, inspiration with a beat that made people feel good and represented the sound of the African American church from back in the day. And so that's why he got the name Father of Gospel Music.
Wow. Now, the Pilgrim Baptist Church, as you know, is the original church is now closed. What's going to happen to that church? Do you know? Yes.
Well, Don Jackson of Capital City Productions, the gentleman that runs the Stellars, is heading up a project to try to renovate that into a national gospel music museum. I can't remember the numbers, but I know it's in excess of maybe 15 million or something. And in stages, it'll be a museum, but it'll also be an educational facility and a place where people can come and learn about gospel music, but not just Chicago, national. And I think that would be fabulous. It hurts me to see that building sit there like that.
Yes, it does.
And all that history that came out of there. Mm-hmm. So I really hope that it works out. I think it would be great.
Well, I hope they have a studio there too, so that they can record.
I believe that's part of the process, and also I think he wants to have something involved with the Stellar Awards there. Certainly all the archived shows and materials and memorabilia from the Stellars would be there as well. So it'll kind of be like a Stellars museum as well.
So who would you call today like a father of gospel music?
Well, I would have to say if there's a kind of a next generation, it was probably Richard Smallwood. In as much as he sort of follows Dorsey's principles. Dorsey was very much about the meaning of the music, not letting the instruments get ahead of the voices, making sure that the singers knew the message, articulated the message. It was all about protocol. And to me, Richard Smallwood really brings that all together in his work. As far as young people coming up, that's a very good question. I see some really good artists out there. I would say probably Donald Lawrence probably follows in the next generation of these really true musical. They really blend a tremendous knowledge of music, like Dorsey, like Richard Smallwood, with the essence of it, So these are the songs that will last. These are the true soul food of gospel is what people like Donald Lawrence are doing.
Who's your favorite singer?
My favorite singer of all time, well, Diane Williams of the Cosmopolitan Church of Prayer is one of my favorite singers. But I would probably have to say of all right now, it would have to be Crystal Rucker, who's a singer in the Church of God in Christ. So in terms of modern days.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of back then, Diane Williams. Diane Williams.
That's awesome. So what are young people, or what are we doing to teach young people about Black gospel music, or is it just for old folks?
I'd have to say we're not doing enough. I think we can do a lot more. I think, books like this help. There are other books that are coming out. There's now a movement towards authors writing about the Edwin Hawkins and Andre Crouch era, contemporary gospel. But I think we can do more. I don't. It's not taught in colleges necessarily. I think maybe there's 1 or 2 colleges that teach gospel. It's not taught in high schools. My late wife Pat, she did always teach her students about gospel music and other types of African American music, but gospel. But I think they need to know that the stories, some of the things that people like Albertina Walker dealt with, these are things that they need to know how hard it was for them and how it's still happening in their own lives. Mm-hmm. So it may not be like an Albertina where they could not eat at a restaurant in the South or stay in a hotel in the South. But there are equally insidious things happening to artists today, like use of their materials without their permission, poor treatment, that are part of the story. And we can't stop that story unless we know the history.
You mentioned they went through some things. Now, did the gospel singers have problems staying at hotels too, like the blues and the rock and roll artists?
Absolutely. In fact, they would tell stories about where they'd have to drive hundreds of miles, could not stop to even use the restroom.
What?
Because they knew that if they stopped at in Mississippi or something, they could be discriminated against. The Staple Singers tell a story about, and this was probably in the late 50s, early 60s, I think. They were on their way to a program in the South, and they stopped to get gas. And they were harassed by the gas station attendant. And they actually were chased. I mean, they exchanged words, and then they were chased down the road by the police. And they were just sure they were going to be thrown in jail. And they did nothing wrong then to argue about the price of the gas that they were charged. And once they opened up, the police made them open up their trunk, they saw the pictures and they realized they were the Staple Singers and everything was fine. But Mahalia Jackson, on her way back to New Orleans from Chicago, got pulled over in the middle of the night because she was a black woman driving a Cadillac.
Oh my goodness!
And she was sure they knew who she was. They did not care. They made her get out. They dumped her purse on the ground. They took money. They hauled her to the judge. He woke the judge up in the middle of the night to give her some trumped-up charge and sent her on her way. Luckily, Mahalia was always smart in hiding money on her person, so she was able to not lose everything. But yeah, you'd hear stories regularly from quartets that would be driving, and the police would stop them and say, "What are you doing here?" They would say, "We're gospel singers on our way to a program," and the police wouldn't believe it. They make them get out of the car and sing. In other words, they have to perform for the police before they would let them go.
Oh my goodness, how humiliating.
Yeah, and it happened to many artists. You hear this time and again where they would make them sing. This was routine. This just happened as a routine. They just knew. Some of the artists from the South kind of knew to expect this, but then some of the artists who were born in Chicago really got an eye-opening. But they would stay at homes. A lot of times if a group came into town, like the Caravans or the Lux Singers or somebody from Chicago, and they were appearing at a church in like Laurel, Mississippi or something, everyone would sort of say, I'll take one of the members, I'll take one of the members. They would put them up in their home because they knew there was not going to be a place for them to stay. They couldn't eat anything.
Even in Chicago?
Well, in Chicago was a different story, but even in Chicago, there were instances where artists were not allowed to use the main elevator to get up in a hotel. Had to use the freight elevator. There was a story that it's not just gospel, but a friend of a friend used to work for a record company in Chicago in the 40s, and her mother's job was to get food for the black artists that came to visit the station, because they could not get food, they could not come up the regular elevator, and so her job was to get them what they needed, and in return they would give them copies of her record.
So were they forced to go into the freight elevator?
Sometimes in the freight elevator. It was one of the reasons that Mayo Williams, Ink Williams, who was this wonderfully popular early producer of black music, he was actually the one who brought Mahalia to Decca Records in 1937 to do her first records, Ink Williams. He parted ways with Paramount Records because he was to attend their board meeting and he could not take the elevator. He had to take the freight elevator, and he said, enough of this. I am not going to be doing all this business and helping you build your black music series and have to take the freight elevator, and he quit. And then he went to work, then he started his own label, but he went to work for Decca, and he got Mahalia her first record deal, which didn't go very far. They wanted her to sing blues. But yeah, it was in Chicago. You didn't have it as badly as you did in the South, but there was same issues here in Chicago as far as racism with artists.
So when did it begin to change?
I would say in the late 60s, early 70s. You had, and Chicago actually leads the way in this. Gospel music was fairly conservative when it came to civil rights issues. We think about the songs that the civil rights marchers sang. They were predominantly spirituals. Gospel singers, with the exception of an Inez Andrews or a Mahalia Jackson. Dot Coates, they got involved, they marched, but a lot of people just kind of conservative, didn't want to get involved. But then in the mid-60s, it started to change. I see it with the Freedom Writers. As I was doing the research, and I'm working on another book, I'm seeing the same thing. It wasn't until the Freedom Writers started to get stopped, and then there were the sit-ins. The young people were getting it. In 1963 in Birmingham, that you saw the artists in the North taking notice and saying, we're going to do more than just do a program for the NAACP. We're going to actually get involved in this. And then the music started to change. And so you had gospel going from really not talking explicitly about human rights issues, implicitly, explicitly in the mid-60s. So groups like the Salem Travelers of Chicago doing songs called Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, or doing songs like, why, the children are going astray. Singing more explicitly about what was happening. So the Black Power movement, I think, had a lot to do with changing gospel, making gospel artists feel more empowered, that they could step out without fear of losing their popularity or not getting their songs played on the radio, and making a statement. They didn't have to hide the message anymore.
So what about some of this music that's, to me, is kind of secular, but they call it gospel?
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
I explain it in two ways. In one way, it carries the gospel theme in that in Dorsey's era, the music was jazz and swing. And so he incorporated jazz and swing into his music, but the lyrics were religious. And then later on, you had a little bit of the small jazz combo music in it, sort of propping up gospel. And then, of course, with Edwin Hawkins and Andre Crouch, it was rock and soul and all this. So in some respects, it's not surprising to me that today's artists are looking to take the relevant music of the day, hip-hop, R&B, urban adult contemporary, and blending it in, because that's what keeps it relevant for them. On the other hand, I think we have gotten into a secularization of gospel music. The artists want the red carpet. They want all of the trappings of pop music. And I don't deny that to them. But when you go so far as to try to make the music sound exactly like the song on the R&B station, you start to lose something. I also think there's just a need. There are just so many songwriters that are really good gospel songwriters. You have a Donald Lawrence, a Richard Smallwood, a Vashon Mitchell. These are quality songwriters. Not everybody's a songwriter, but everyone wants to reap the benefits of songwriting. So you get some songs out there that frankly just aren't moving people. I also say too, if you give people sand and call it water, sometimes they'll drink it. And so if you put out music and it's accepted, and it appears accepted, you'll just make more of it. I'm not a big fan of the praise and worship style, only in as much as I think it loses some of those inherent Africanisms that makes gospel gospel. I've gotten into all kinds of arguments over this issue because I know it's a popular style of music, and there are some praise and worship artists who are marvelous, and there's some wonderful songs. But when it starts to sound like Christian contemporary music, I think something is lost. I don't want it to sound like contemporary Christian. I want it to sound like gospel. Yes. I want CCM to sound like CCM. Gospel. There are things that we talked about, you know, the rhythm, the repetition, the call and response. All of these things. I grew up Polish American, so in my community it was polka music. I wouldn't want
You grew up Catholic?
Grew up Catholic. I wouldn't want polka music to sound like something else. I want it to sound like polka music. So I want gospel to sound like gospel. And there are things in gospel that can be translated and have been. So when you hear Leandria Johnson sing Jesus, that is gospel. There are things in that music. There's a message. You see it, how the people respond. That's gospel. There are songs that then sometimes just seem hollow. As Dorothy Norwood once said, you know, this is all fine, but when I am really hurting, I need a good old gospel song to make me feel better. And that's what I think we need. I mean, that's where I get into arguments with people is I'll say, you know, well, they'll say, well, it's not all about, you know, me feeling better. It's also about me praising the Lord. Well, yes. I mean, back in those days, we called those devotionals. So we had devotionals back in the day. Can't you write a devotional song that doesn't use the same 7 words 11 times in a row? Yes. So I think there's a need for more song. And again, this goes back to your point about education. If we mention the name Roberta Martin to a group of teenagers right now who listen to gospel music, they probably don't know who that was. They might not even know who Mahalia Jackson was.
Or Sally Martin.
Right. I mean, I know Reverend Stanley Keeble once said when he went over to the Mahalia Jackson school, some of the children there didn't know who Mahalia Jackson was, and they were going to her school. Sally Martin. These are people who were the foundations of the music. And we need to keep their names alive. Just as we keep alive the names of people like W.C. Handy and other forms, and Duke Ellington and Count Basie.
But who's going to remind us? Should it be taught in school?
I think it should be taught in school. I really think that it ought to be there should be, particularly in Chicago, I'll just speak for Chicago at this point, there ought to be classes in the high schools that talk about Chicago music and the contribution to Chicago music. So gospel, R&B, all the wonderful things that artists have done here, black, white, brown, all kinds.
Perhaps you can lead such a charge and teach such a class.
I've actually tried. I have to say, whenever I've tried to ask somebody about this, I get no response.
You didn't ask the right person.
Apparently not. Apparently not, yes. But I think that, and I know that there are people who are working to try to get gospel music as a curriculum in colleges, and I believe Valparaiso has it, and I believe there's a school on the East Coast that has it. But these are forgotten heroes who really need to have their story told, who suffered so much. I mean, I know we didn't put this in the book. There was some suggestion that it might have been maybe not appropriate. I don't know if I agree with that. But there were artists who told me they suffer from kidney disease today because of the times they traveled and could not stop to use the restroom because they were not welcomed. So they had to, quote, hold it for miles and miles and miles, and ended up with severe kidney problems as a result. The quality of food you had to eat, the old gospel chicken, which was a bologna sandwich, 2 pieces of white bread.
Well, I understand they had to bring that and have it in the car because they couldn't stop at restaurants.
Exactly. And then you had to drive, and so you had to sleep in the car, and it was a tremendous sacrifice for little money, and they might get there, and the promoter didn't have the money that they had promised. So, in fact, the Dixie, I think it was maybe even the Dixie Hummingbirds or the Sensational Nightingales or one of these top groups, went all the way down to Florida for a program, only to find out the program was canceled and nobody told them. They had no money to get back. They bought peaches and oranges along the side of the road and ate them all the way back home. And that's the kind of thing that happened. Or you'd stay at somebody's home and somebody might take one of your items of clothing. So the things that they suffered on behalf of wanting to do this music need to be reminded, because these are stories that they have their relevance in today's world. As we talk about what's happening today in the way of racial relations, there are other kinds of stealing happening, and we can't let that continue.
Well, speaking of relevance, and lastly, there are some songs where where the singers will preach and then sing. How do you feel about that?
That's always been part of gospel. It all depends on what their focus is on. I know there's a lot of audience members who prefer the singing. So they say, keep the preaching to a minimum and show me the singing. But on the other hand, there has been that aspect of gospel music since the very beginning, where artists would introduce a song with a small sermon. James Cleveland was extremely popular with that. He would open, and he learned that from Eugene Smith here in Chicago. Eugene would, with the Roberta Martin singers, he would open a song with a quote of scripture or try to show its relevance to the song at hand, and then they would sing it. And then James Cleveland did that, and now many do that as a way to kind of introduce the song and its relevance so people understand the message. So I don't mind it as long as it doesn't get too long and take away from the singing.
Well, you're a fascinating interview and a fascinating book, and once again, I urge you to buy Mr. Robert Marovich's book called A City Called Heaven, Chicago and the Birth of Gospel Music. Thank you for watching the Strausberg Report, and thank you again, Mr. Marovich, for being on our program.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.